10-minute murder.
Susan Smith was born as Susan Daniels in 1961. She was raised in Freeburn, Kentucky, alongside 9 siblings, and with a mother who worked as a housekeeper and a father who lost his job in the local coal mines, the Daniels children often had to go without. In the 7th grade, Susan had no choice but to drop out of school. Her parents just couldn't afford to pay the fees. When she was 15 years old, Susan met 22-year-old Kenneth Smith. Susan didn't care that Kenneth was a grown man 7 years her senior, or that he made a living selling cocaine, PCP, and methamphetamine. In 1979, a few years after their relationship began, Susan and Kenneth got married, just as she turned 18. Due to Kenneth's role as a local prominent drug dealer, drugs were a big part of his relationship with Susan from the very start, and it only got worse after they were married. Susan might have expected Kenneth to settle down and become more responsible when he became a father, but soon enough, she was a mother of 2, and she was fighting with Kenneth more than ever. Eventually, Susan and Kenneth agreed that they were simply not compatible enough to be in a romantic relationship. They decided to get a divorce, but continued living in their family home together for the sake of their young children. In the late 1980s, Kenneth's circle of friends in Pikeville, Kentucky, were beginning to track the attention of the FBI. Investigators were interested in one man in particular, 32-year-old Carl Edward Lockhart, who was known by the nickname Cat Eyes. Carl had already been convicted of robbery, but the FBI believed that he was planning to carry out more crimes in the future. In 1988, a young agent was assigned to the case, 21-year-old Mark Putnam. Mark was a criminologist who had graduated from the FBI Academy 2 years prior, in 1986. Shortly after his graduation, he had gotten married to his longtime girlfriend, Kathy, before he launched into full-time work as an agent. When Mark met with the local deputy, Albert Hartfield, the deputy strongly recommended somebody who would be able to help the FBI with the case. Albert told Mark that he had a friend by the name of Susan Smith who would be able to act as an informant and share information about Carl Lockhart and his crimes. Mark met Susan and agreed to offer her financial compensation in exchange for her help, and Susan was happy to regularly contact Mark, updating him with any news she had about Carl. In total, Susan was paid $5,000 for her assistance, which today is around $13,000. Thanks to Susan's input, Mark successfully arrested Carl in late 1987, and the following year, he was charged with robbery and sentenced to more than 50 years behind bars. Once Carl Lockhart was behind bars, Mark expected that he would stop communicating with Susan. But for Susan, their relationship had taken on a new meaning. She didn't just see herself as a paid informant for the FBI. In fact, she believed that she and Mark had a special connection. She wanted to continue talking to him even though the case was closed, and even though he was married to another woman. Eventually, Mark decided that he also felt a connection to Susan, and the pair kept growing closer. Before the end of 1988, their close relationship had become sexual, and Susan was overjoyed. They would sneak around together, arranging to meet up at local motels for sex, and driving to secluded places where they could be together. For Susan, it was exciting. However, Mark was anxious. He knew that he was breaking countless rules by having a sexual and romantic affair with an informant. He'd managed to keep it quiet, but if the FBI found out, he would lose his job, and if his wife found out, it would destroy his marriage and family life. Mark decided that he needed to get away from Susan and focus on his career, so he requested to be transferred to Florida, hoping that time away from Kentucky would force Susan to move on from their relationship. A year later, a new investigation into a string of car thefts led Mark right back to Kentucky, where Susan was waiting for him. She told him that she was 4 months pregnant and that she knew he was the baby's father. For Mark, it was as if all of his nightmares had come true. He couldn't just leave his wife to raise a baby with another woman, but he also knew that Susan wouldn't let it go. In desperation, he offered to adopt the baby himself and raise it with his wife, who he believed would agree to stay with him as long as he ended the affair with Susan. Immediately, Susan refused this offer. She was having the baby, and she wanted Mark to raise it with her. On the 8th of June, 1989, Mark took Susan for a ride in his rental car, and then parked in a remote clearing to continue their discussion. He tried to convince her to give the baby up. She tried to convince him to leave his wife for her. It was clear to Mark that they would never agree, and he felt that if Susan had the baby, his infidelity and unprofessionalism would be exposed. He felt like he was backed into a corner, and Susan felt the same way. As their argument continued to escalate and Susan began to slap him, Mark felt like he had no other choice. He began to strangle Susan, continuing even after she stopped struggling and lost consciousness. He later claimed that he panicked and tried to resuscitate her, but was unsuccessful. Once Mark was sure that Susan was dead, he dragged her body out of the passenger seat and laid it in the trunk of the rental car. He left it there overnight before driving out to an abandoned coal mining road around 10 miles north of Pikeville, where he hoped the body would remain undiscovered for years. He didn't turn himself in to the authorities or show any signs of remorse for killing Susan and their unborn child. After dumping the body, Mark simply drove straight back home to Florida and reunited with his family. But the Susan Smith problem didn't disappear for Mark. After only 3 days, Susan's sister, Shelby Ward, became concerned and reported her as missing. The investigation quickly highlighted a person of interest, Mark Putnam, the FBI agent who had a close connection with Susan and had been in town during the time that she went missing. As soon as Mark was suspected to be involved in the disappearance, the case became a federal matter, and the FBI began to investigate their own agent. In 1990, Mark was asked to undergo a polygraph exam, which he failed. Side note, I've mentioned on this podcast several times over the years my disdain for polygraph tests. And the reason I've said is because they're only a little more accurate than a coin flip. There's a reason that they aren't admissible in court, and people over the years of me saying this on the podcast have asked for more information on how I decided that. Is there a court case to reference? And rather than giving my opinion again, this comes from the American Psychological Association relating to polygraphs. It says, polygraph testing has generated considerable scientific and public controversy. Most psychologists and other scientists agree that there is little basis for the validity of polygraph tests. Courts, including the United States Supreme Court, U.S. versus Sheffer in 1998, have repeatedly rejected the use of polygraph evidence because of its inherent unreliability. Nevertheless, polygraph testing continues to be used in non-judicial settings, often to screen personnel, but sometimes to try to assess the veracity of suspects and witnesses, and to monitor criminal offenders on probation. So if the police have you in an interrogation room and they say, we want to give you a polygraph test, and you pass it, they know that you could pass it and still be guilty. So they might come back into the interrogation room and say, well, you failed that thing, so let's talk, because they're allowed to lie to you. And also, you could be completely innocent, but very nervous about being there in an interrogation room and talking to the police, and maybe someone you were close to has just been murdered, and you fail it. But you're innocent, but you fail it. The police are going to put so much pressure on you because of that failed polygraph test. So that's why I don't like them. But that's not to say that sometimes they don't get it right, because when Mark Putnam failed his, he finally gave up. He felt like the investigation was closing in on him, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to fool the FBI. Shortly after the polygraph, he confessed that he had strangled Susan to death and gave a detailed description of where her body could be found. Sure enough, Susan's remains were discovered, and Mark was arrested, becoming the first FBI agent ever to be convicted of murder. Compared to Carl Lockhart, the robber we mentioned earlier, and his 57-year sentence, Mark received a relatively light sentence for strangling his affair partner to death, only 16 years behind bars. Mark was described as a model inmate. He was polite and courteous, never causing any trouble, and always followed orders. Because of his good behavior, he was released after serving only 10 years of his sentence, but his wife, Kathy, who had stood by him throughout his incarceration, had recently passed away due to complications of alcohol abuse. At 41 years old, Mark Putnam was now a free man and a widower. He decided to start a new life for himself, moving to Georgia, and eventually got remarried. To this day, it's unknown whether Susan Smith had ever truly been pregnant or if she was lying about her pregnancy as a way of ensuring that Mark would leave his wife to be with her. In her conversations with Mark, she'd claimed to be 4 months pregnant, and Mark had been convinced that she was telling the truth. But when the remains were examined during an autopsy, the medical examiner found no signs of a fetus. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. My name is Joe, I'm the host, and thank you so much for listening today. If you're new to 10-Minute Murder, welcome. Crack open a fresh Bailey's. Glad you're here. Make yourself comfortable. And please subscribe now wherever you're listening to this podcast, and you can more easily catch up on all the back episodes. Connect with me on social media to see the pictures of what we talk about here in the podcast. It's never gross or graphic. You just see the people and the places that we're talking about. There may be crime scene photos, but I promise you, I will never show you something that's going to gross me out, and I have a pretty low threshold. I don't like nightmares, so I don't want to see that stuff, so I'm not going to share that with you. Even if I wanted to post gross crime scene photos, Zuckerberg would kick me straight off of Facebook. And hey, if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, or any place that is possible. I really enjoy getting your positive feedback. All right, that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder.